Sometimes life's greatest treasures hide in unlikely places, waiting for someone brave enough to look past appearances. Elias Vance learned this the day he bought an abandoned blacksmith shop for pocket change. Townspeople called it cursed, claimed the vanished blacksmith haunted it. But Elias walked in and found heavy equipment under tarps, anvils and molds painted black. When his hammer struck the anvil, it didn't ring like steel. It thudded dull and heavy. Suspicious, Elias chipped the black paint. Beneath gleamed pure gold. The blacksmith had masterminded the Great Gold Heist of 1875, melting stolen bullion into tools and painting them to hide in plain sight. What would you do in a room where the furniture is solid gold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elias Vance had seen his share of sunrises, but the one breaking over Redemption Creek that morning held a particular quality of promise. At 58 years old, with hands scarred by rope and hammer, he understood that promise was often just another word for possibility, and possibility could lead a man down roads both fortunate and treacherous. He stood on the dusty main street, his weathered boots planted firm, studying the building that would either prove his salvation or his folly. The blacksmith shop squatted at the eastern edge of town like a forgotten tombstone, its walls darkened by years of coal smoke and neglect. The windows were boarded tight, with planks that had gone silver with age, and the heavy wooden door hung slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Above it all, a hand-painted sign swung gently in the morning breeze, the letters barely readable: Silas Blackwood, Master Smith. Elias had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 weeks prior, with everything he owned packed into 2 saddlebags and a bedroll. His horse, a patient mare named Duchess, was the only companion he had left after 30 years of wandering from mining camps to cattle ranches, from railroad construction sites to timber operations. He had worked every job a strong back and steady hands could manage, saved every dollar that whiskey and bad luck didn't claim first, and now, in the autumn of his working years, he wanted something that belonged to him alone. The town itself had seen better days. Redemption Creek had boomed in the late 60s when gold was found in the surrounding hills, but that fever had broken years ago. What remained was a community of about 200 souls, decent folk mostly, who worked hard farms and small businesses, who attended church on Sundays and helped their neighbors when times got rough. The main street held a general store, a modest hotel with a saloon attached, a church with a leaning steeple, and a handful of other establishments that served the practical needs of frontier life. Elias had taken a room at the hotel, a clean enough space with a bed that didn't sag too badly and a window that looked out on the street. The proprietor was a widow named Margaret Holloway, a handsome woman in her middle 50s, with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that measured a man carefully before deciding whether to trust him. She ran a respectable establishment, served decent meals, and didn't tolerate nonsense from the cowboys and drifters who occasionally passed through. "You're looking at the Blackwood place again," Margaret said one evening, as Elias sat on the hotel's front porch, smoking his pipe and watching the shadows lengthen. She settled into the chair beside him with a cup of coffee in her hands. "That building's been empty near about 9 years now." "I heard tell of that," Elias replied, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who had spent more time talking to horses than people. "Heard tell the owner vanished." Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Silas Blackwood. Strange man. Kept to himself, mostly. Did fine work, though. Folks came from 3 counties over for his ironwork. Then one morning in the spring of 76, he just wasn't there anymore. Shop locked up tight, forge gone cold. Nobody ever saw him again." "Man doesn't just disappear without reason," Elias observed. "No, he doesn't." Margaret's voice held a note of something deeper, an old sadness perhaps. "Sheriff looked into it at the time, found nothing missing, nothing disturbed. Silas's tools were all there, his personal effects upstairs in the living quarters, even money in a tin box under his bed. It was like he'd stepped out for a moment and never came back. Elias drew on his pipe, the tobacco glowing red in the gathering dusk. What do folks think happened? Folks think all manner of things. Some say he had troubles nobody knew about, that he wandered off into the hills and met his end out there. Others claim he had a woman somewhere, that he ran off to start fresh. Then there's the ones who whisper about hauntings and curses, but those are mostly the young people looking to scare each other. She paused, studying Elias's profile. Why do you ask? You thinking about the place? Might be. He met her gaze directly. I'm looking to settle somewhere, put down roots, before I'm too old to work. A man needs a trade, and I've done enough smithing in my time to manage a forge. Margaret considered this information carefully. The building belongs to the town now. After 7 years with no word from Silas, the territorial court declared him legally deceased. The mayor and council voted to sell it, use the money for town improvements. They've had it listed for 2 years with no takers. People afraid of ghosts? Elias asked with a slight smile. People are practical, Margaret corrected gently. The building needs work, and there's already young Tom Fletcher set up as a smith on the west end of town. His father taught him the trade, and he does good work. Folks don't see the need for another blacksmith in a town this size. Elias understood the logic, but he also understood something else. Tom Fletcher was 23 years old, newly married, building his business and his reputation. He didn't need an older man as competition, and more importantly, Elias didn't want to smith for others anymore. He wanted the building itself, the structure, the location at the quiet edge of town where a man could think and work and be left alone. The next morning, he visited the mayor's office, a small room attached to the general store. Mayor Calvin Brewster was a round man with a fringe of grey hair circling his bald crown and the permanent expression of someone carrying too many worries. He looked up from his ledger when Elias entered, his eyebrows rising in polite inquiry. "Mr. Vance, isn't it? How can I help you this fine morning?" Elias removed his hat, holding it in both hands. "I want to buy the Blackwood property. The old blacksmith shop." Brewster's eyebrows climbed higher. "Is that so? Might I ask what you intend to do with it?" "Live in it. Work in it. It's a good building. Solid built. I'm not looking to compete with young Fletcher. I've got other plans in mind, but I need a place that's mine." The mayor leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "The asking price is $300. The building and the quarter-acre it sits on." $300 was more than Elias had hoped, but less than he'd feared. He had $420 saved, money earned through sweat and sacrifice, money that represented every dream he had left. "I'll give you $150, cash money, today." Brewster shook his head slowly. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your interest, but the town council set that price deliberately. We need those funds for the school roof and new water pumps." "The building's been empty 9 years, Elias counted quietly. "Every year it sits, it deteriorates more. Roofs probably got leaks, foundations settling, pests moving in. In another 5 years, it won't be worth half what you're asking. I'm offering you money today, money you can put to use right now, and I'll take the property as is, no complaints, no demands." The mayor drummed his fingers on the desk, the sound marking time while he thought. $175, and I'll need to present it to the council. $160, and you tell the council a citizen wants to invest in Redemption Creek, wants to restore a piece of property that's been bringing down the appearance of your main street. They settled at $165. The council met 2 days later and approved the sale with little discussion. Most of them were simply relieved to have the problem solved, the property back on the tax rolls, and the money available for community needs. Elias signed the deed in the mayor's office, counting out the bills with steady hands, while Margaret Holloway and the town clerk witnessed the transaction. When he walked out into the afternoon sunlight, he owned something for the first time in his adult life. The weight of it settled on him differently than he'd expected, not heavy with burden, but solid with responsibility. He stood before the building that evening, key in hand, studying every detail. The structure was roughly 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep, built from local stone and heavy timber. The roof was shingle, weathered but intact from what he could see. The front door was solid oak, warped slightly but still on its hinges. To the side, a set of exterior stairs led up to the second floor, where the blacksmith had maintained living quarters. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door opened with a groan of protest. Elias stepped inside and stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Dust particles danced in the thin light that leaked through cracks in the boarded windows, and the air smelled of cold metal, old ash, and years of stillness. The workshop occupied the main floor, a large open space dominated by the central forge. Even cold and dark, it commanded respect, a massive brick structure with iron grates and a chimney that rose through the roof. Scattered around the space were the tools of the blacksmith's trade, an assortment of hammers, tongs, and chisels hanging on the walls, barrels that had once held water for quenching hot metal, and along the far wall, several large shapes covered by heavy canvas tarps. Elias moved through the space slowly, his boots leaving tracks in the dust. Everything held the particular stillness of abandonment, as if time itself had stopped the day Silas Blackwood walked away. On a workbench near the forge, he found a leather apron folded neatly, and beside it a pair of thick gloves, waiting for hands that would never return. The living quarters upstairs were modest, a single room with a bed, a table and 2 chairs, a small cookstove, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. Elias didn't linger there. The space felt too personal, too much like trespassing on another man's private life. He would clean it eventually, make it his own, but not today. Back downstairs, he lit the oil lamp he'd brought from the hotel and examined the covered shapes more carefully. There were 5 large tarps, each draped over what appeared to be heavy equipment. He lifted the edge of the nearest one, revealing a massive anvil mounted on a thick wooden stump. The anvil's surface was painted black, unusual, but not unheard of. Some smiths protected their equipment against rust that way. He moved to the next tarp and found a large vise bolted to a heavy workbench, also painted black. Under the third tarp sat several press molds and forming blocks, all bearing the same dark coating. The fourth and fifth tarps concealed more specialized equipment, swage blocks, hardy tools, and various gauges, all uniformly black. The consistency struck him as odd. Painting tools to prevent rust was one thing, but this seemed excessive, almost deliberate in its thoroughness. Every piece of heavy equipment in the shop wore the same dark disguise. Elias hung the lamp on a hook near the forge and stood in the center of his new property, thinking. Outside, the sun had set completely, and Redemption Creek had gone quiet for the night. In the lamplight, his shadow stretched long across the dusty floor, a solitary figure in a space that held secrets he couldn't yet name. Tomorrow, he would begin cleaning, organizing, making the place habitable. Tomorrow, he would start the work of building his new life. But tonight, standing alone in the darkness, with only the lamp's flame for company, Elias Vance felt the strange weight of inherited mystery pressing against his curiosity. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. The path of an honest man seeking simple peace was about to take a turn into territory where gold and greed, where long-buried secrets and present dangers would collide. All of it waited patiently in the darkness, hidden beneath layers of black paint, waiting for the right man to ask the right questions. Elias locked the door behind him and walked back to the hotel through the empty street, the key heavy in his pocket, his mind already moving through the work that lay ahead. The first 3 days passed in a blur of physical labor that Elias welcomed. He swept decades of dust from every corner, scrubbed the windows until light poured through clean glass, and hauled out the accumulated debris of abandonment, bird nests, broken pottery, rusted buckets that had lost their bottoms to time. The work felt good, honest, the kind of effort that left a man tired but satisfied when evening came. Margaret brought him meals wrapped in cloth, refusing payment until he finally negotiated a reasonable weekly rate. She seemed pleased to see the old building coming back to life, and sometimes she would linger at the doorway, sharing stories about Silas Blackwood that painted a picture of a man both skilled and solitary. He could make anything from iron, she told Elias one afternoon, watching him oil the hinges on the forge's access door. Gates that looked like they grew from the ground itself, weather vanes so perfectly balanced they'd spin in the slightest breeze. People said he had magic in his hands, but I think it was just patience and an eye for detail most folks don't possess. Did he have family? Elias asked, working the stiff metal carefully. Not that anyone knew about. He appeared in Redemption Creek back in '71, already a master at his trade. Bought this lot and built the shop with his own hands. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always fair in his dealings. Never took advantage when folks couldn't pay full price. Children were a little afraid of him on account of his size and his silence, but he never gave anyone reason to think ill of him. The more Elias learned about Blackwood, the stranger the man's disappearance seemed. A skilled craftsman with a thriving business, respected if not particularly liked, doesn't simply walk away from everything he's built without reason. Something had driven Silas Blackwood out of Redemption Creek, or something had prevented him from ever returning. On the fourth morning, Elias decided to deal with the heavy equipment. He couldn't properly organize the workshop while everything remained under those tarps, and besides, he wanted to assess what he actually had. A good anvil alone was worth considerable money, and if the forge equipment was sound, he might be able to do small repair jobs for himself and maybe a few neighbors, nothing that would threaten young Tom Fletcher's business. He pulled the tarps off one by one, folding them carefully and setting them aside. The morning light, streaming through the clean windows, illuminated the collection of tools and equipment. Everything was painted the same, flat black, which still struck Elias as peculiar. Paint-protected iron, true enough, but this seemed like more than simple maintenance. The main anvil drew his attention first. It was a beautiful piece, larger than any he'd worked with before, mounted on an oak stump that had been sunk deep into the floor. The horn curved gracefully, and the face appeared perfectly flat, despite years of disuse. Someone had taken exceptional care of this tool. Elias ran his hand across the surface, feeling the slightly rough texture of old paint. On impulse, he picked up a hammer from the wall rack, a medium-weight cross-peen that felt good in his grip. He wanted to hear the anvil's ring, that clear, sustained note that told a smith the metal was sound and properly hardened. He struck the face firmly, expecting the sharp, singing clang of good steel. Instead, the hammer produced a dull, heavy thud, as if he'd hit something soft and dense. The sound was wrong, completely wrong. No proper anvil made that kind of dead sound. Either the metal was flawed, cracked internally, or Elias struck it again, harder this time, listening carefully. The same muffled thud echoed through the workshop, absorbed rather than reflected. His mind cycled through possibilities. Maybe the anvil was filled with sand for weight, or maybe the black paint was so thick it dampened the sound. He set down the hammer and studied the anvil more carefully. The paint was thick, applied in multiple coats, but he could see a few small chips near the base where something heavy had scraped against it. Those chips showed dark metal underneath, consistent with cast iron. But something nagged at him. The weight of the anvil seemed excessive even for its size, and that strange, dead sound when struck bothered him more than he could explain. Elias trusted his instincts. They'd kept him alive through mine cave-ins and stampeding cattle, through winter storms and dangerous men. Those instincts were telling him now that something about this anvil wasn't right. He went to the tool rack and selected a cold chisel and a small hammer. Back at the anvil, he positioned the chisel against one of the existing chips in the paint and tapped it gently, just enough to flake away a little more of the coating. The paint came off in small fragments, revealing the metal underneath. Elias leaned closer, angling the piece to catch the light. His breath caught in his throat. Beneath the black paint, the metal gleamed with a soft, unmistakable yellow color. Not the dark grey of iron or steel, not the silver of tin or lead. Yellow. Warm and lustrous, even under decades of disguise. Elias's hands started shaking. He told himself to slow down, to think clearly, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. He chipped away another small section of paint, revealing more of that impossible yellow gleam. Gold. The anvil was made of gold. He stepped back, his legs suddenly unsteady, and sat down hard on a nearby crate. His mind raced through calculations he could barely organize. An anvil that size, if it was solid gold, would weigh he couldn't even estimate properly. Hundreds of pounds. Thousands of dollars. No, not thousands. Tens of thousands. Maybe more. He looked around the workshop with new eyes. The other equipment, all painted the same black, all sitting there silent and patient. The vises, the swage blocks, the press molds, the forming tools, how much of it was really iron, and how much was something far more valuable? Elias stood slowly, moving to the large vise mounted on the heavy workbench. He took the chisel and chipped at the paint on the vice's screw mechanism, a spot where the damage wouldn't be immediately obvious. More black paint flaked away, and beneath it, the same soft yellow metal gleamed in the morning light. His hands were shaking so badly now that he had to set down the tools. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside into the fresh air. The street was empty. Redemption Creek going about its morning business with no idea that its newest resident was standing in front of a workshop that contained a fortune in gold. The Great Gold Heist of 1875. Elias had heard the story years ago. Everyone in the territory had. A railway shipment bound for the Denver Mint, carrying gold from the Colorado mines, had been stolen in a daring robbery. 6 men had stopped the train, killed 2 guards, and made off with bullion worth over $200,000. The robbers had vanished completely, and despite massive manhunts and investigations, the gold was never recovered. The case remained the most infamous unsolved crime in territorial history. And now Elias understood where it had gone. Silas Blackwood, the quiet blacksmith of Redemption Creek, had been part of that heist. Maybe he'd been one of the robbers, or maybe he'd been the fence who melted down the distinctive bullion to hide its origin. Either way, he'd taken that stolen gold and transformed it into something brilliant in its deception. He'd made it into tools, heavy and practical, painted them black, and hidden them in plain sight. A man could walk into this workshop, see anvils and vises and molds, and never suspect that the furniture itself was worth a king's ransom. It was genius, really, audacious and patient, and absolutely brilliant. And it meant that Silas Blackwood's disappearance 9 years ago took on a much darker significance. Men who stole that much gold didn't just wander off into the wilderness. Either someone had killed him for the treasure, or he'd fled from someone who was getting too close to the truth. Elias went back inside and locked the door behind him, his mind working through the implications. He owned this building legally, had the deed signed and witnessed, but the gold inside it had been stolen, which meant it legally belonged to the railroad company, or to the government, or to whoever had the best lawyers and the strongest claim. If he reported the discovery, he would lose everything. The gold would be seized, his property might be seized as evidence, and he'd be left with nothing but a reputation as the man who found a fortune and had to give it back. The railroad companies had attorneys who could tie a man up in legal proceedings for years, and Elias didn't have the money or the energy for that kind of fight. But if he kept silent, if he took the gold for himself, he'd be no better than Blackwood and the men who'd stolen it in the first place. He'd be a thief, living on blood money, looking over his shoulder for the rest of his days. Elias sat down on the dusty floor, his back against the wall, and stared at the anvil that had just shattered his careful plans for a quiet retirement. The morning sun poured through the windows, illuminating the black-painted equipment, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of Tom Fletcher's hammer ringing clear and true on honest steel. He had found his treasure all right. Now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Elias lay in his hotel room bed, staring at the ceiling, while his mind turned over the problem from every angle. The smart thing would be to report it, let the authorities handle it, and walk away clean. But the smart thing would also leave him broke and back where he started, drifting from town to town with nothing to show for a lifetime of hard work. He thought about Margaret downstairs, about the decent people of Redemption Creek who'd welcomed him without suspicion, who'd sold him that property in good faith. They had no idea they'd handed him a fortune. And he thought about Silas Blackwood, wherever he was, dead or alive, and the guards who died in that robbery 18 years ago, men with families, men who'd just been doing their jobs. By dawn, Elias had made a decision of sorts. He would investigate further before doing anything irreversible. He needed to understand exactly what he had, how much of it there was, and what had really happened to Blackwood. Maybe there were answers in the building itself, clues that would tell him what to do. He spent the next morning carefully examining every piece of equipment in the workshop. Using the chisels sparingly, he tested small, hidden spots on each item. The results made his stomach tight with tension. Nearly everything of substantial weight was gold. The anvils, the vises, the large swage blocks, the heavy press molds, all of them were solid gold painted to look like common iron. He found only a few pieces of actual steel, the hammers, the tongs, some of the smaller tools. These were the items a blacksmith would handle constantly, things that needed to be strong and resilient in ways gold could never be. The heavy equipment, though, the pieces that mostly just sat there bearing weight and providing mass, those were the treasure. Elias did rough calculations based on the size and weight of the larger pieces. If he was right, there was somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of gold in this workshop. At current prices, that represented a value beyond his ability to properly comprehend. He could live like a rich man for the rest of his life and still have enough left over to fund an entire town. The enormity of it terrified him. On the third day after his discovery, while cleaning the upstairs living quarters, Elias found something that changed his understanding again. Behind the bed, tucked between the frame and the wall, was a small leather journal. Its pages were stiff with age, and the handwriting inside was precise and controlled. The journal belonged to Silas Blackwood, and it contained entries dated from 1871 to early 1876, shortly before his disappearance. Most of it was mundane notes about orders fulfilled, sketches of ironwork designs, observations about the weather and local events. But the final dozen pages told a different story. Blackwood hadn't been one of the robbers. He'd been approached by them after the heist, hired to dispose of the gold in a way that couldn't be traced. They'd brought him bullion in the dead of night, and he'd melted it down in his forge, recasting it into the shapes of common tools. The work had taken him nearly a year, done in secret while he maintained his regular business. The entries grew increasingly anxious as time passed. Blackwood wrote about his fear of being caught, about the weight of his crime, about wanting to be free of the whole business. And in one of the final entries, dated February 1876, he wrote something that made Elias's blood run cold. "They're planning to kill me. I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. Once the tools are finished, I'm a liability. They'll take the gold and silence me permanently. I've hidden this journal as proof, in case someone finds it after I'm gone. The gold belongs to the Denver Mint. It was stolen on the 12th of August, 1875, from the Western Express train. The men who did it are James Kettering, Frank Wiley, and Tom Ashford. I was a fool to help them, and now I'll pay for my foolishness." The final entry was dated the 3rd of March, 1876. After that, the pages were blank. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, the journal heavy in his hands. Blackwood had been murdered, almost certainly. The thieves had killed him, but something had prevented them from taking the gold. Maybe they'd been caught, or killed themselves, or driven away by circumstances Elias could only guess at. Whatever the reason, the treasure had stayed hidden for 18 years, waiting. He thought about those names: James Kettering, Frank Wiley, Tom Ashford. Were any of them still alive, still searching for their hidden fortune? The idea sent a chill down his spine. If word got out about the gold, if those men or their associates learned someone had discovered it, Elias's life would be worth less than dust. But the journal also gave him something else, proof that Blackwood had been coerced, that he'd regretted his actions, that he'd wanted the gold returned to its rightful owners. That gave Elias a strange kind of permission, a sense that he might be able to find a path that honored Blackwood's final wishes while still securing his own future. The question was, how? He couldn't march into the sheriff's office and explain the situation. Even if the sheriff believed him, the discovery would become public knowledge within hours. The railroad company would swoop in with lawyers, the territorial government would want its cut, and curious seekers would descend on Redemption Creek like locusts. The town would be torn apart by gold fever, and Elias would end up with nothing but trouble. But he also couldn't just keep the gold and sell it off piece by piece. That much gold showing up in the market would draw attention, trigger investigations. And trying to move even one of those anvils would be nearly impossible. They weighed far too much to transport without help, and hiring help meant involving others in the secret. Elias spent that evening on the hotel porch again, smoking his pipe and thinking. Margaret joined him, as usual, Stan Places Khan, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke. "You've been looking troubled these past few days, Mr. Vance. Is everything all right with the building? No serious damage you didn't expect?" He considered lying, but found he couldn't do it smoothly. "Just working through some complications. Nothing that can't be managed, I hope." She studied him with those perceptive eyes. "Sometimes the hardest complications are the ones inside our own heads. The building is just wood and stone. It's how we choose to use it that matters." Her words hit closer to home than she knew. Elias nodded slowly, drawing on his pipe. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Holloway." "I've had time to become one," she replied with a slight smile. "Life has a way of teaching us, if we're willing to learn." That night, lying in bed once more, Elias made another decision. He would not report the gold, and he would not keep it for himself. Instead, he would find a third path, one that might honor both Blackwood's regret and his own need for security. It would take time, careful planning, and more courage than he'd needed in years. But Elias Vance had always been patient, and he'd always been careful. If there was a way through this maze of gold and guilt, he would find it. The journal remained hidden in his room, its secrets safe for now. Tomorrow he would begin the real work, not cleaning the shop or organizing tools, but figuring out how to be both honest and smart in a situation where those two qualities seemed impossible to reconcile. The plan began to take shape slowly, like iron cooling in a mold. Elias spent his days working on the building, making visible improvements that would justify his presence and his investment. He repaired the roof shingles, reinforced the door frames, and began the careful process of restoring the forge to working order. To anyone watching, he was simply a man settling into his new property, nothing more. But at night, alone in the workshop with the doors locked and the windows covered, he conducted different work. He studied each piece of golden equipment, measuring and weighing, calculating and planning. He also began researching the original heist, visiting the town's small library and reading through old newspaper archives. The librarian, a spare woman named Miss Thornton, who'd taught school in Redemption Creek for 30 years, helped him find the relevant issues without asking why he wanted them. The newspapers from August 1875 told the story in dramatic detail. The Western Express train had been carrying gold from 3 mining operations, bound for the Denver Mint. 6 armed men had stopped the train by blocking the tracks with a fallen tree, overwhelmed the guards, and escaped with 42 ingots, each weighing approximately 25 pounds. 2 guards had died in the robbery, Samuel Brennan and Patrick O'Hare, both family men from Denver. The newspapers had printed sketches of them, honest faces with wives and children who'd lost husbands and fathers to criminals' greed. Elias studied those faces for a long time, feeling the weight of what he'd inherited. The authorities had hunted the robbers for months, but the trail had gone cold somewhere in the mountains west of Denver. The gold had never been recovered, the thieves never caught. Eventually the story had faded from the newspapers, replaced by newer outrages and fresher scandals. But Elias now knew where at least some of the robbers had gone. They'd found Silas Blackwood, somehow recognized his skill, and convinced or coerced him into helping them hide their stolen fortune. And then, according to the journal, they'd killed him to keep him silent. The question that troubled Elias most was why they'd never come back for the gold. If they'd murdered Blackwood in March of 1876, why hadn't they taken the tools and disappeared? Something had prevented them. Something significant enough that the gold had stayed hidden for 18 years. He found a partial answer in a newspaper from April 1876. A small article reported that 3 men had been killed in a shootout with law enforcement near the Colorado-Wyoming border. The names weren't released, but the article mentioned that the men were suspected of involvement in several crimes, including possible connection to the Western Express robbery. Elias couldn't be certain, but the timing aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. If Kettering, Wiley, and Ashford had been those 3 men, it would explain everything. They'd killed Blackwood, but before they could retrieve the gold, they'd been hunted down and killed themselves. The secret had died with them, leaving the fortune hidden in plain sight, which meant Elias might be the only living person who knew the truth. The realization brought both relief and deeper responsibility. There was no one hunting for this gold anymore, no criminals who might threaten him if word got out. But there were still the families of those dead guards, still the railroad company that had insured the shipment, still the question of what was right versus what was legal versus what was possible. On a cool morning in October, 6 weeks after buying the property, Elias received an unexpected visitor. A man rode into town on a quality horse, dressed in a suit too fine for Redemption Creek's dusty streets. He stopped first at the mayor's office, then made his way to the blacksmith shop, where Elias was working on replacing some floorboards. "Mr. Elias Vance," the man called from outside. Elias set down his tools and stepped into the doorway. "That's right. Can I help you?" The man dismounted, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "My name is Howard Prescott, attorney representing the Western Railroad Trust. I understand you recently purchased this property." Elias's heart kicked hard against his ribs, but he kept his face calm. "I did. Is there a problem?" "Not at all. Not at all." Prescott smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "The trust maintains an interest in certain properties throughout the territory, particularly those that might have historical connection to our operations. This building, we've learned, belonged to a man named Silas Blackwood, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances around the time of a significant theft from one of our trains." "I heard he disappeared," Elias said carefully, "but that was years before I arrived in Redemption Creek. I bought the building from the town, all legal and proper." Of course. Your ownership isn't in question." Prescott handed him the envelope. "This is simply a formal notice that the Western Railroad Trust maintains a standing claim to any property, assets, or materials connected to the theft of August 1875. Should you discover anything unusual or valuable on these premises, you are legally obligated to report it immediately. Failure to do so could result in criminal charges for receiving stolen property." Elias took the envelope, his hand steady despite the cold sweat breaking out along his spine. "I appreciate the notification, Mr. Prescott, but this is just an old blacksmith shop. I don't expect to find anything more valuable than some rusty tools." Prescott studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp and assessing. Silas Blackwood was a skilled craftsman, Mr. Vance. Skilled men sometimes hide things in clever ways. If you should find anything at all that seems out of place or unusual, the trust would be very generous with a finder's fee. 20% of recovered value, paid in cash, no questions asked about how you discovered it. 20%. If the gold was worth $300,000 in 1875, inflation and increased gold prices might put it closer to $500,000 now. 20% of that would be $100,000, more money than Elias could earn in 3 lifetimes. But it would also be an admission that he'd found the gold, and once that admission was made, he'd lose all control of the situation. The railroad would swoop in, seize everything, and Elias would be left hoping they kept their promise about the finder's fee. "I'll keep that in mind," Elias said neutrally. "If I stumble across a pile of gold bars, you'll be the first to know." Prescott's smile thinned. "See that you do, Mr. Vance. The trust has a long memory and considerable resources. We don't take kindly to those who try to profit from our losses." After Prescott rode away, Elias stood in the doorway for a long time, the envelope heavy in his hand. Inside was a formal legal document, exactly as Prescott had described, all properly notarized and official. The railroad was covering its bases, making sure that if the gold ever surfaced, they could claim it legally. The visit changed things. It meant the railroad hadn't forgotten about the theft, hadn't given up on recovering their loss. They were watching, waiting, keeping track of anything that might lead them to their missing property. One wrong move, one careless word, and Elias would find himself buried under legal proceedings he couldn't hope to fight. That evening, he sat with Margaret on the hotel porch once more. She noticed the envelope sticking out of his pocket and asked about it casually. "Railroad company attorney," Elias said, deciding that partial truth was safer than complete lies. "They wanted to notify me that my building used to belong to someone who might have been involved in an old robbery. Just covering their legal obligations," they said. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "You mean the Western Express theft?" "Yes. Folks wondered about that when Silas disappeared. The timing seemed suspicious, happening so soon after that robbery, but nothing was ever proven." "Did you believe he was involved?" Elias asked. She considered the question carefully, her gaze distant. "I believed he was troubled by something in those final months. He'd always been quiet, but toward the end he seemed frightened, like a man waiting for something terrible to happen." She paused. "Whatever his sins, I hope he found peace." Elias thought about the journal, about Blackwood's final words expressing regret and fear. "I hope so too." The complications were mounting now, layers of danger and obligation piling up like clouds before a storm. But Elias had faced storms before. He just needed to be smart, patient, and careful about his next moves. The gold wasn't going anywhere. Time was on his side, if he used it wisely. Winter came early to Redemption Creek that year, bringing snow in November and temperatures that kept folks close to their fires. Elias worked through the cold, installing a proper stove in the upstairs living quarters and making the workshop weather-tight. He moved his belongings from the hotel, though he continued taking most of his meals there, partly for the company and partly because Margaret's cooking was considerably better than his own. The routine of daily life helped settle his nerves. He fell into the rhythms of the town, nodding greetings on the street, attending church on Sundays, not out of particular devotion, but because it was what neighbors did. People accepted him gradually, the way small communities accept newcomers with cautious friendliness that would either grow into trust or fade into polite distance, depending on how he conducted himself. Tom Fletcher, the young blacksmith, stopped by one afternoon with a wagon wheel that needed repair. "Heard you might have some old forming tools," he said, a bit sheepish. "I'm working on a commission for the Dawson Ranch, decorative hinges and a gate lock. My tools are good for practical work, but I could use something with a finer touch." Elias had to think fast. Most of his tools were solid gold and far too heavy to be used for actual work. But he'd found a few genuine iron pieces in a back corner, apparently the items Blackwood had used for his legitimate business, while the golden equipment sat unused. "I might have something that'll help," Elias said, leading Tom inside. He showed him a set of swage blocks and forming hammers, real steel that rang true when struck. Tom's eyes lit up at the quality of the metalwork. "These are beautiful pieces. Blackwood's work?" "I believe so. You're welcome to borrow them. I'm not doing smithing myself, just using the space for storage and a workshop for carpentry repairs." Tom hefted one of the hammers, testing its balance. "You know, folks wondered if you'd compete with my business. I'm glad that's not your intention. This town isn't really big enough for 2 full-time smiths." "I've done enough hard labor for one lifetime," Elias said honestly. "I'm looking for quiet now, not competition." They talked for a while about metalwork and the challenges of running a business in a small town. Tom was a good young man, earnest and skilled, trying to build something lasting for his new wife. Elias found himself liking him, which made the secret he was keeping feel heavier somehow. After Tom left with the borrowed tools, Elias stood in the workshop and looked at the painted anvils with fresh eyes. Every one of them represented stolen property, blood money taken at the cost of 2 men's lives. The fact that he hadn't stolen it himself didn't change what it was. And now he was lying to decent people, hiding the truth from neighbors who'd welcomed him into their community. The weight of it pressed on him during the long winter nights. He'd read Blackwood's journal so many times he'd memorized parts of it. The smith's growing fear, his regret, his desire to make things right, all of it resonated with Elias's own struggle. Blackwood had been trapped by his choices, had died because of them. Elias didn't want to follow that same path. But he also didn't see a clear way forward. The railroad's legal notice sat in his desk drawer, a constant reminder that any attempt to claim or sell the gold would bring immediate consequences. And the families of those murdered guards, Brennan and O'Hare, deserved justice, or at least restitution. But Elias had no way to provide it without destroying his own life in the process. Margaret noticed his troubled state, though she was too respectful to pry directly. Instead, she offered companionship, conversation, and occasionally gentle wisdom that came from her own experiences with loss and difficult choices. One evening in December, while they sat by the fire in the hotel's common room, she told him about her late husband. Robert died 15 years ago. Pneumonia took him in just 3 days. We had 23 years together, built this hotel from nothing, raised 2 children who've since moved to California. After he passed, I had to decide whether to sell everything and join the children, or stay here and run the business alone. "Why did you stay?" Elias asked. "Because this place was ours, his and mine together. Selling it would have felt like erasing him, like admitting that everything we built didn't matter once he was gone." She paused, staring into the fire. "But keeping it meant being lonely, meant working twice as hard for half the profit, meant watching my children build their lives far away while I stayed here with memories." "Do you regret it?" She smiled softly. "Some days yes, some days no. That's the truth of most important decisions. They're not clearly right or wrong. They're just the choices we make, and then we live with the consequences and try to find meaning in them." Her words struck deep. Elias had been looking for a perfect solution, a way to be completely honest while also protecting himself. But maybe life didn't offer that kind of clarity. Maybe all he could do was make the best choice he could see and then live with whatever came after. "You're a thoughtful man, Elias," Margaret continued. "I've watched you these past months, seen how you interact with people, how you work. Whatever troubles you're carrying, I trust that you'll find your way through them honestly." The faith she placed in him felt both comforting and crushing. He wanted to deserve it, wanted to be the man she seemed to think he was, but he was sitting on a fortune in stolen gold, lying by omission every day, wrestling with temptations he'd never imagined facing. That night, alone in his quarters above the workshop, Elias made a list. On one side, he wrote what he knew for certain, on the other, what he suspected or hoped. The facts were simple. The gold was stolen, the thieves were dead, the railroad wanted it back, and keeping it secret was becoming harder each day. The hopes were more complicated. He hoped there was a way to do right by everyone, the murdered guards, families, the railroad, himself, even Silas Blackwood's memory. He hoped that his months of patience and planning would reveal a path he couldn't yet see. He hoped that when the moment of decision came, he'd have the courage to choose wisely. But hope, he'd learned over 58 years of living, wasn't the same as certainty. And in the darkness of a winter night, with the wind howling outside and the weight of gold pressing down through the floorboards, certainty felt very far away. The following week brought another complication, this one unexpected. Mayor Brewster stopped by the workshop with news that the town council was considering a new tax assessment on commercial properties. The blacksmith shop, being one of the larger buildings in town, would see its taxes increase significantly. "It's nothing personal, Elias," Brewster explained, looking genuinely apologetic. "The school needs a new roof, and we're trying to raise funds fairly across all property owners. Your building is assessed at commercial rates because of its size and former use." Elias did quick calculations. The proposed increase would eat into his remaining savings considerably. He could afford it for a year, maybe two, but not indefinitely. The irony was bitter. He was standing in a room worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet he might struggle to pay a few hundred in taxes. "I understand," he said to Brewster. "I'll manage it somehow." After the mayor left, Elias sat on the stairs leading to his quarters and let out a long breath. The complications kept mounting, each one adding pressure, forcing him toward decisions he wasn't ready to make. Time was supposed to be his ally, but instead it was becoming his enemy. Each passing day bringing new problems he couldn't solve without confronting the central truth he was trying to avoid. Something would have to give, and soon. He just hoped that when it did, he'd be ready. January brought a bitter cold snap that froze the water in the creek and kept most people indoors. Elias used the enforced isolation to do something he'd been avoiding. He wrote letters. 3 of them, each carefully composed, each representing a different possible future. The first letter was addressed to the Western Railroad Trust, explaining that he'd discovered what he believed to be the missing gold from the 1,875 robbery. This letter offered full cooperation in exchange for the promised finder's fee and a legal guarantee that he would not face charges. It was the safe choice, the honest choice, the one that would let him sleep without guilt. The second letter was to a gold dealer in Denver, inquiring about the current market for large quantities of raw gold and what documentation would be required for such a transaction. This letter represented the selfish choice, the one that would make him rich but leave him looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. The third letter was to the families of Samuel Brennan and Patrick O'Hare, the guards who died in the original robbery. He'd found their names in the old newspapers and tracked down addresses through careful research. This letter explained what he'd found and offered to ensure they received compensation, though it didn't specify how he would accomplish that. He sealed all 3 letters but mailed none of them. They sat in his desk drawer alongside Blackwood's journal, representing 3 different versions of Elias: Vance, the honest man, the greedy man, and the man trying to split the difference. He didn't know yet which one he would choose to be. Margaret's friendship deepened through the winter months. They fell into a pattern of shared meals and evening conversations, talking about everything from town gossip to philosophy to their respective pasts. She told him about her children in California, showed him their letters, shared her pride in their accomplishments and her sadness at their distance. He told her about his years of wandering, the jobs he'd worked, the places he'd seen. He spoke about loneliness that came from never having roots, about watching other men build families and legacies while he moved from place to place with nothing but what he could carry. "Did you never want to marry?" she asked one evening. "I wanted to," he admitted. There was a woman once, back in my 30s, Sarah, her name was. She was a schoolteacher in a mining camp where I worked. We talked about marriage, but I couldn't offer her stability. I was barely keeping myself fed, and she deserved better than a life of uncertainty. She married a bank clerk instead, had 4 children, last I heard, made the right choice. Margaret's expression was soft with understanding. And you never found anyone else? I stopped looking. Seemed easier that way. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But lately, I've been thinking maybe it's not too late. Maybe a man can still build something meaningful, even in the last quarter of his life. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Margaret smiled, a gentle expression that acknowledged what he'd said without forcing him to elaborate. It's never too late for meaningful things, Elias. Not if we're brave enough to reach for them. That conversation stayed with him, adding another layer to his moral calculations. If he reported the gold, took the finder's fee, he'd have enough money to propose a real future, not just to Margaret, though he'd begun hoping in that direction, but to the community itself. He could invest in the town, help with the school, maybe even start a legitimate business that would give him purpose beyond mere survival. But if he tried to keep the gold, to profit from Blackwood's crime, what kind of foundation would that be for a new life? Could he build something honest on a dishonest fortune? Could he look Margaret in the eye, share a life with her, knowing he was living a lie? February brought an unexpected visitor who forced Elias to confront these questions more directly. A man arrived in town, asking questions about Silas Blackwood, claiming to be a nephew from back east, who'd only recently learned of his uncle's disappearance. His name was Thomas Blackwood, and he carried documents that seemed to prove his relationship to the missing Smith. Elias met him in the workshop, watching carefully as Thomas examined the space his uncle had built. The younger man was in his late 30s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with eyes that missed nothing. "I appreciate you allowing me to visit," Thomas said, running his hand along one of the painted anvils. "I never met my uncle, but my father spoke of him often. Said he was a brilliant craftsman but a troubled soul." "Troubled how?" Elias asked, trying to sound casually interested. "My father always believed Uncle Silas had gotten mixed up with the wrong people. He was skilled enough that criminals would have valued his services." Thomas paused, his gaze direct. The timing of his disappearance, so close to that train robbery, always seemed suspicious to the family. Elias felt the weight of scrutiny, the sense that this conversation was more than it appeared. "Do you think he was involved?" "I think he knew something," Thomas replied carefully. "And I think that knowledge might have gotten him killed. I've spent years researching what happened to him, Mr. Vance. I've followed every lead, read every report. I even know the names of the men who robbed that train." The workshop felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. Elias kept his expression neutral. "Is that why you're here? Looking for answers about your uncle?" "I'm here because I believe my uncle died trying to do the right thing. Whatever he was involved in, I think he regretted it. I think he tried to make amends, and it cost him his life." Thomas met Elias's eyes steadily. "If there's anything in this building that might tell me the truth about what happened to him, I'd be grateful to know it. Not for profit, not to claim anything that isn't mine, just for peace of mind, and to honor his memory properly." The honesty in Thomas's voice rang true, but Elias had learned that sincerity could be performed as easily as any other emotion. He'd also learned that the nephew of a murdered man might have legitimate claims on property connected to that death, claims that could complicate Elias's already tangled situation. "I found a journal," Elias said after a long pause, "hidden behind the bed upstairs. It belonged to your uncle." Thomas's composure cracked slightly, hope and apprehension warring in his expression. "May I see it?" Elias retrieved the journal from his quarters, watching as Thomas read through it with hands that trembled slightly. When he reached the final entries about the murder plot, tears tracked down his face. "They killed him," Thomas whispered. "Those bastards killed him for helping them, just like he feared they would." "It appears so," Elias said quietly. Thomas closed the journal carefully, his grief evident, but controlled. He wanted the gold returned. He wrote that clearly. He knew it was wrong to help them hide it. He looked around the workshop, his gaze moving across the painted equipment. Do you know what happened to it? To the gold? This was the moment. The question hung in the cold air of the workshop, demanding an answer that would determine everything that followed. Elias could lie, claim ignorance, and send Thomas away with only the journal for comfort. Or he could tell the truth and see where honesty led him. He thought about Margaret's faith in him, about the letters in his desk drawer, about Blackwood's final wish to make things right. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be in whatever years remained to him. I know exactly where it is, Elias said. Thomas Blackwood set the journal down slowly, his eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made the older man's instincts prickle. The grief that had seemed so genuine moments before was still there, but underneath it, Elias now sensed calculation. Show me, Thomas said quietly. Elias picked up the chisel and approached the nearest anvil. With deliberate care, he chipped away a section of black paint, revealing the gleaming gold beneath. Thomas stepped closer, his breathing quickening as he watched more of the yellow metal emerge. My God, he whispered. He really did it. He melted down the entire shipment and hid it here. Near about, Elias confirmed. Most of the heavy equipment in this shop is solid gold painted black. I've tested all of it. Thomas reached out to touch the exposed metal, his fingers trembling. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there, absorbing the reality of what he was seeing. Then he straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed harder, more businesslike. Mr. Vance, I need to be honest with you about something. I am Silas Blackwood's nephew. That part is true, but I'm also here representing the Western Railroad Trust. They hired me 6 months ago to investigate any properties connected to my uncle, believing that family connection might open doors that official inquiries couldn't. Elias felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression steady. So the railroad knows I have the gold? No, Thomas said quickly. They know I'm investigating, but I haven't reported anything yet. That's where this gets complicated. He pulled a chair close and sat down, gesturing for Elias to do the same. The railroad offered me 10% of anything I helped them recover. 10% of $500,000 in today's value, that's $50,000, more money than I could earn in a lifetime of honest work. So, why are you telling me this, instead of just reporting it and collecting your reward? Thomas's laugh was bitter. Because I read my uncle's journal. Because I know he died trying to make things right. Because $50,000 won't bring him back or ease the guilt I've carried all these years, wondering what happened to him. He paused, his jaw working. And because the railroad doesn't deserve the full recovery without acknowledging their own part in this tragedy. Their part? Elias asked. The guards who died, Brennan and O'Hare, they weren't just victims of criminals. They were victims of corporate negligence. The railroad knew that route was dangerous, knew robberies had happened before, but they cut costs by sending insufficient protection because ensuring the shipment was cheaper than hiring enough guards. My uncle wrote to my father about it years before the robbery, said the railroad's greed was going to get someone killed eventually. Thomas pulled out a packet of letters from his coat, yellowed with age. I found these in my father's effects after he died, letters from Uncle Silas, dating back to 1873. He worked for the railroad before opening his own shop, knew their operations intimately. He tried to warn them about security weaknesses, and they ignored him, because fixing the problems would have cost money. Elias scanned the letters quickly. They detailed exactly what Thomas had described, Silas Blackwood warning railroad officials about vulnerable shipment routes, suggesting improvements that were dismissed or ignored. The letters painted a picture of a man who understood security and tried to prevent exactly the kind of robbery that eventually happened. So what are you proposing? Elias asked. A different kind of justice, Thomas replied. The railroad will get their gold back, but not all of it. We keep enough to provide real compensation to Brennan's and O'Hare's families, substantial amounts that will make a difference in their lives. We also keep enough to fund a memorial and a scholarship program in their names. The railroad gets the majority of their missing property returned, but they also have to acknowledge their negligence publicly as a condition of the recovery. And us? Elias asked. What do we get? Peace of mind, Thomas said. The knowledge that we did right by everyone involved, including my uncle's memory, plus the railroads offered finder's fee for you, 20%. On the portion we return, that's still a substantial sum, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. It was a good plan, better than anything Elias had conceived himself, but there was still a problem. One that Thomas's next words confirmed he'd already considered. The complication is how we prove the railroad's negligence without revealing that my uncle was part of the original crime. If we're not careful, we could destroy his memory instead of honoring it. Elias thought about this carefully. What if we present it differently? What if your uncle discovered the gold hidden here by the thieves after they killed each other? What if he was trying to figure out how to return it safely when something happened to him? Maybe an accident, maybe something else, but not murder. Thomas considered this. That protects his reputation, but it doesn't pressure the railroad to acknowledge their responsibility. No, but we don't need them to do it publicly. We just need them to do it privately, as a condition of getting most of their gold back. We tell them we know about the security warnings, about the negligence. We tell them they can have the gold, but only if they make substantial payments to the families and fund the memorial. If they refuse, we go public with everything, the negligence, the warnings they ignored, all of it. Thomas's eyes widened as he understood. We're not giving them a choice. We're making a deal they can't refuse without massive public embarrassment and potential legal liability. Exactly. They get their property back, but they pay for their mistakes. Your uncle's reputation stays intact, the families get compensation, and we get to sleep at night knowing we did the right thing. They talked through the details for hours, working out the logistics, the timing, the exact approach they would take. Thomas would contact the railroad through proper channels, arrange a meeting, and present the terms. Elias would remain in the background initially, the property owner who'd made an unusual discovery and wanted to resolve it properly. But as they refined the plan, Elias noticed something troubling in Thomas's expressions. Subtle shifts in tone that suggested the younger man wasn't entirely committed to the moral high ground. At one point, discussing the amounts they would take for the families, Thomas suggested figures that seemed too low, leaving more for their own finder's fees. 20,000 each for the families, Thomas proposed. That leaves us with better compensation for all the risk we're taking. The families get 50,000 each, Elias countered firmly. Minimum. These women lost their husbands, their children lost fathers. 20,000 is an insult. Thomas's jaw tightened. You're being emotional. This is business. This is justice, Elias corrected. If that's not what you're interested in, Thomas, then maybe we need to reconsider this partnership. The younger man backed down, but the exchange revealed a truth Elias had suspected. Thomas Blackwood was caught between honoring his uncle's memory and securing his own fortune, and Elias wasn't certain which impulse would win out when the moment of decision arrived. That night, after Thomas left to arrange the meeting with the railroad, Elias sat alone in the workshop and faced an uncomfortable realization. He'd found a partner, maybe even found a path forward, but he'd also created new vulnerabilities. Thomas knew everything now, knew where the gold was and what it was worth. If the younger man decided to betray him, to make his own deal with the railroad, Elias would have no recourse. Trust was a gamble, and Elias had just put everything on the table. He looked at the painted anvils, at the fortune hidden in plain sight, and wondered if Silas Blackwood had felt this same mixture of hope and fear when he'd made his own desperate choices 18 years ago. The smith had tried to do right in the end, but it had cost him his life. Elias could only hope his own attempt at justice would end differently. Outside, the February wind howled through Redemption Creek, carrying snow and the scent of coming change. Inside the workshop, surrounded by painted gold and the weight of other men's crimes, Elias Vance prepared himself for whatever would come next. The path forward was set. Now he just had to walk it without stumbling. The meeting was scheduled for March 15th, 6 weeks away. Thomas explained that the railroad's board of directors met quarterly, and they would need that time to assemble the right people, verify Thomas's claims, and prepare their response. 6 weeks felt like both too much time and not nearly enough. Elias used the interval to prepare in ways that had nothing to do with gold. He consulted with a lawyer in the next county over, a man named Jameson Pierce, who had a reputation for discretion and competence. Elias didn't reveal the full situation, but he asked enough hypothetical questions about property rights, finder's fees, and legal obligations to understand his position better. In matters involving recovered stolen property, Pierce explained, the law generally favors the original owner or their legal successors. However, a finder who acts in good faith and attempts to return property through proper channels is typically entitled to reasonable compensation. The key phrase is good faith. If you delay reporting or attempt to profit before making that report, the law views it much less favorably. Elias absorbed this information carefully. By those standards, he'd already crossed into questionable territory. He'd known about the gold for months without reporting it, had actively hidden the discovery from the railroad attorney who'd visited. But Pierce also noted that complexity of the situation, including reasonable concerns about personal safety and the need to verify what he'd found, could be presented as justification for the delay. The courts understand that ordinary citizens aren't investigators, Pierce continued. If you discovered something unusual, taking time to understand what you had and how to proceed properly wouldn't necessarily be seen as acting in bad faith. Especially if you ultimately do the right thing. The qualification at the end, if you ultimately do the right thing, echoed in Elias's mind long after he left the lawyer's office. Meanwhile, Thomas visited twice more, each time refining their strategy. He drafted a formal letter to the railroad, carefully worded to convey that a significant discovery had been made without revealing too many specifics. The letter requested a confidential meeting to discuss matters pertaining to the Western Express robbery of 1,875 and the potential recovery of materials related thereto. They'll send representatives, Thomas predicted. Probably a senior attorney, maybe an executive from the board. They'll want to verify everything before committing to anything. And when they see the gold, Elias asked. That's when we present our terms. We'll have documentation-ready copies of Uncle Silas's letters, evidence of their security negligence, calculations of what we're proposing to return versus what we're keeping for the families. We frame it as their best option. Get most of their money back quietly, or face public scrutiny about their role in creating the conditions for the robbery. It was a sound plan, but Elias noticed that Thomas's emphasis kept shifting. Sometimes he focused on justice for the families, on honoring his uncle's memory. Other times, he seemed more interested in the mechanics of the negotiation, in maximizing their leverage. The younger man's motivations remained mixed, and that uncertainty troubled Elias more as the deadline approached. He confided some of his concerns to Margaret one evening. They'd grown closer through the winter, and while he still hadn't told her everything about the gold, he'd begun to hint at the nature of his troubles. "I've made a partnership with someone," he said carefully, "for a business matter. But I'm not entirely certain I can trust him to act with integrity when money is involved." Margaret set down her knitting, giving him her full attention. "Do you have a choice? Can you proceed without this partner?" "Not easily. He has connections and knowledge I don't have, but if he decides to betray me, I'll lose everything." She considered this thoughtfully. "My father used to say that you can't control what others do, only what you do. If you act with integrity, even if your partner doesn't, at least you'll be able to face yourself in the mirror." That's not nothing, Elias. Even if integrity costs me dearly, especially then, that's when it matters most. She reached across and touched his hand gently. Whatever this business is, I trust you to handle it rightly, and good men find their way through dark places. Her faith in him was both comforting and terrifying. If she knew the whole truth, the gold, the months of secrecy, the moral calculations he'd been making, would she still believe in his goodness? Or would she see him as just another man who'd let greed cloud his judgment? The night before the meeting, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat in the workshop, a single lamp burning, and wrote a letter he might never send. It was addressed to Margaret, explaining everything. The gold, Blackwood's journal, the plan with Thomas, his own struggles with what was right versus what was legal versus what was possible. He wrote it all out in careful detail, not as a confession exactly, but as an explanation. If things went wrong tomorrow, if he was arrested or killed or disappeared like Blackwood, he wanted someone to know the truth. He sealed the letter and left it in his desk drawer with the others, insurance against an uncertain future. At dawn, Thomas arrived with a large leather case containing the documents they'd prepared. He looked nervous, but determined, dressed in a suit that made him seem older and more authoritative. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elias replied. They'd arranged to meet the railroad representatives at the workshop itself. Thomas had argued for this, saying it was important to let them see the gold in its original context, to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. But Elias suspected another reason. Having the meeting here gave him home field advantage, put the railroad people in his space rather than neutral ground. The representatives arrived exactly on time. Howard Prescott, the attorney who'd visited months ago, and a man introduced as Charles Whitmore, senior vice president of the Western Railroad Trust. Whitmore was in his 60s, distinguished, with the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of authority. He studied the workshop with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Blackwood," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the particular accent of old Boston money. "Your letter made some interesting claims. I'm here to determine if they have merit." "Thank you for coming," Thomas replied smoothly, taking charge of the conversation as they'd planned. "I think you'll find our discovery exceeds whatever expectations you might have had." He led them to the first anvil and used the chisel to chip away more paint, revealing the gold beneath. Prescott's eyes widened, but Whitmore's expression barely changed. The executive was clearly a man who'd learned to control his reactions, to give away nothing until he'd assessed all the angles. "How much?" Whitmore asked simply. "We estimate between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of gold," Thomas replied, "cast into the shapes of blacksmith equipment and painted to avoid detection. We believe this represents the majority, possibly all, of the gold stolen in the 1875 Western Express robbery." Whitmore stepped closer, examining the exposed metal, then moved to check other pieces. He was thorough, taking his time, asking technical questions about how they'd discovered it and what verification they'd done. Elias let Thomas handle most of the answers, watching the railroad men carefully for tells, for signs of how they might react to the terms they hadn't yet heard. Finally, Whitmore straightened. "Gentlemen, you've made a remarkable discovery. The railroad is prepared to offer a generous finder's fee for the return of this property, 20% of the verified value, as our standing policy dictates." "We appreciate that," Thomas said, "but we're not simply returning the gold. We're proposing a more complex arrangement, one that addresses certain historical injustices related to the original robbery." Prescott's expression hardened. "What kind of arrangement?" This was the moment. Thomas laid out their terms with the clarity of a prepared speech. The railroad would receive approximately 80% of the gold. The remaining 20% would be divided among several purposes: substantial compensation to the families of the murdered guards, funding for a memorial and scholarship program in their names, and finder's fees for Thomas and Elias. Additionally, the railroad would issue a formal statement acknowledging that improved security measures which had been recommended prior to the robbery but not implemented might have prevented the tragedy. These terms are non-negotiable, Thomas concluded. If the railroad wishes to recover its property, this is the only arrangement we'll accept. Whitmore's face remained impassive, but Prescott looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. You're attempting to extort the railroad into admitting negligence. That's unacceptable. We're offering you a chance to do the right thing, Elias interjected, speaking for the first time since the presentation began. Those guards died protecting your gold. Their families deserve more than a footnote in a company report. This is your opportunity to honor them properly. And if we refuse? Whitmore asked quietly. Thomas pulled out copies of Silas Blackwood's warning letters. Then we go public with these, with documentation showing that your company was warned about security vulnerabilities and chose to ignore them because it was cheaper to ensure shipments than to protect them properly. We explain that 2 men died because of that decision, and that the railroad's negligence facilitated the crime that led to this situation. The workshop fell silent. Whitmore studied the letters, his expression finally showing something not quite anger, not quite respect, but a kind of cold assessment. He was calculating odds, weighing consequences, considering angles Elias couldn't even imagine. "Gentlemen," Whitmore said after a long moment, "I'll need to consult with our board. This is not a decision I can make unilaterally." "We understand," Thomas replied. "We'll give you 2 weeks. After that, our offer expires, and we pursue other options." After the railroad men left, Elias and Thomas stood in the workshop, the tension slowly draining away. They'd played their hand. Now they could only wait to see how the railroad would respond. "That went well," Thomas said, but his voice held uncertainty. Elias wasn't so sure. Whitmore was too controlled, too calm. Men like that didn't show their true intentions until they were ready to act. The next 2 weeks would determine everything, and Elias had the uncomfortable feeling that the railroad was already several moves ahead in a game whose rules he didn't fully understand. He just hoped he and Thomas hadn't miscalculated fatally. The railroad's response came in 9 days, not 14. Whitmore returned alone this time, arriving in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning when the town was quiet and few people were around to notice an important visitor. He came directly to the workshop where Elias was organizing tools, Thomas having traveled back east to handle some personal business. "Mr. Vance," Whitmore said, his tone businesslike, "I'd like to speak with you privately." Elias's instincts prickled, but he invited the executive inside and closed the door. Whitmore didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The railroad's board has reviewed your proposal. We're prepared to accept most of your terms with certain modifications." "What kind of modifications?" Elias asked carefully. "We'll provide compensation to the guards' families, $50,000 each, as you suggested. We'll fund the memorial and scholarship program. We'll issue a statement acknowledging that security improvements might have prevented the tragedy, though we won't admit legal negligence." Whitmore paused. "But we won't pay finder's fees to you or Mr. Blackwood." Elias felt his jaw tighten. That wasn't the agreement. "The agreement was predicated on good faith recovery," Whitmore replied coolly. "But our investigation into this matter has revealed some troubling facts. You purchased this property in September. It's now March. That's 6 months during which you possess stolen property without reporting it. That's not good faith, Mr. Vance. That's concealment." The accusation hit like a physical blow, all the more painful because it was true. Elias had known this vulnerability existed, had worried about it, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it real. "I needed time to understand what I'd found," Elias said, knowing how weak it sounded. "Time to figure out the right way to proceed." 6 months, Whitmore repeated, "during which you consulted lawyers, made plans with Mr. Blackwood, and prepared to leverage our property for personal gain. That's not the behavior of an honest finder, Mr. Vance. That's the behavior of someone who saw an opportunity and tried to profit from it." Elias wanted to argue, but the truth was more complicated than he could easily explain. Yes, he'd delayed reporting. Yes, he'd considered keeping the gold. But he'd also struggled with the moral implications, had ultimately chosen a path that tried to honor everyone's interests. "So what are you proposing?" Elias asked. "We take the gold. All of it. We compensate the families and fund the memorial as promised, but you and Mr. Blackwood receive nothing beyond the satisfaction of doing the right thing. If you refuse these terms, we'll pursue legal action for concealment of stolen property. You'll face criminal charges, and you'll lose this building and everything in it through civil forfeiture." The threat was clear, and Whitmore had the power to make good on it. Elias could fight, could try to prove his good intentions, but legal battles cost money he didn't have, and time he couldn't afford. The railroad had resources that could crush him completely. "And Thomas?" Elias asked. "What does he say about these new terms?" Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been satisfaction or might have been regret. "Mr. Blackwood has already accepted. He signed an agreement with us 2 days ago. In exchange for his cooperation and his testimony that you delayed the discovery report, we're paying him the full 10% finder's fee he was originally promised, approximately $50,000. The betrayal struck like a hammer blow. Thomas had sold him out, had taken the railroad's offer, and agreed to testify against Elias to justify the new terms. All the talk about honoring his uncle's memory, about doing right by the families, it had been a performance, a way to get close to the gold while maintaining the appearance of nobility. Elias sat down heavily, feeling every one of his 58 years. He'd gambled on trust and lost everything. "I need time to think about this," he said quietly. "You have 24 hours, Whitmore replied, not unkindly. "After that, we proceed with legal action. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I actually believe you meant well, but intent doesn't change the law. You possess stolen property for 6 months without reporting it. That's a crime, regardless of your reasons." After Whitmore left, Elias sat alone in the workshop, surrounded by the gold that had seemed like salvation and turned out to be his undoing. He'd tried to find a middle path between greed and surrender, between selfishness and foolishness, and in the end he'd found only loss. The painted anvils sat silent and heavy, mocking him with their hidden wealth. All that gold, more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, and he'd end up with nothing but legal troubles and a broken spirit. He thought about Margaret, about the life he'd imagined building in Redemption Creek. He thought about the letters in his desk drawer, each one representing a different version of himself, and he thought about Silas Blackwood, who died trying to make things right and left behind only mysteries and trouble. Sometimes, Elias reflected bitterly, doing the right thing just meant choosing which way to lose. That evening, Elias sat on Margaret's porch and told her everything. The gold, the journal, the plan with Thomas, the betrayal, the railroad's ultimatum. He held nothing back, letting the whole complicated mess spill out while she listened in silence. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. "I knew something was troubling you," she finally said. "I didn't know what, but I could see the weight of it." "I should have reported it immediately," Elias said. "The moment I found the gold, I should have contacted the authorities. Instead, I sat on it for months, trying to figure out how to profit from it, and now I'm going to lose everything." "Are you?" Margaret asked. "It seems to me you still have a choice. Between accepting their terms or facing criminal charges, that's not much of a choice. I mean, a choice about who you want to be." She turned to face him directly. "You can accept their terms and walk away with nothing but your integrity. Or you can fight, spend years in court battles you'll probably lose, and still end up with nothing except bitterness and debt. Or," she paused, "you can find a third option nobody's considered yet." Elias looked at her, puzzled. "What third option?" "The families," Margaret said simply. "You've been treating the railroad as if they own the gold, but they don't. Not anymore. The moment those robbers stole it, the insurance company paid out the claim. The railroad got their money 18 years ago. The gold belongs to the insurance company now, not the railroad. The realization hit Elias like lightning. Margaret was right. The Western Railroad Trust had been made whole by their insurance policy. They didn't have legal standing to claim the gold the insurance company did, and the railroad had been negotiating as if they owned it, probably hoping Elias wouldn't understand the legal distinction. "They've been running a bluff," Elias said, understanding flooding through him. "They can't sue me for concealing their property because it's not their property." "Exactly, but the insurance company can if they want to. The question is, would they?" Margaret smiled. "Insurance companies are in business to make money. If you offered them a deal that gets them most of their gold back without expensive legal proceedings, why wouldn't they take it?" Elias's mind raced through the possibilities. He could contact the insurance company directly, bypass the railroad entirely, and offer the same basic arrangement: most of the gold returned, with portions set aside for the families and a reasonable finder's fee. The insurance company would get an unexpected windfall from a case they'd probably written off decades ago. They'd have every incentive to be reasonable. "You're a brilliant woman," Elias said, feeling hope kindle for the first time in days. "I'm a practical woman who's dealt with enough contracts and business arrangements to understand how these things actually work." She touched his hand gently. "But Elias, even if this works, even if you negotiate a good outcome with the insurance company, you have to understand that the railroad will be furious. They thought they had leverage over you, and you're about to prove they don't. They'll make trouble if they can." "Let them try," Elias said, his voice harder than it had been in months. "I'm tired of being pushed around by people who think money gives them the right to dictate terms." The next morning, Elias sent a telegram to the Continental Insurance Company in New York, explaining that he'd discovered property related to a claim they'd paid in 1875 and wished to discuss proper procedures for return and recovery. He kept the message brief, but clear enough to get their attention. The response came within 2 days. The insurance company was very interested in discussing the matter and was sending a representative to meet with him within the week. When Whitmore returned for Elias's answer to the railroad's ultimatum, he found himself facing a very different man than the defeated one he'd left behind. "I've consulted with a lawyer," Elias said calmly, "and I've learned some interesting things about property law and insurance claims. The gold doesn't belong to the railroad, Mr. Whitmore. It belongs to Continental Insurance. So I've contacted them directly to arrange for its return." Whitmore's composure cracked for the first time, anger flashing across his features. "You can't do that. We have an arrangement." "We had a proposal that you modified without my consent," Elias corrected. "And even that proposal was based on the false premise that the railroad owned the property in question. You don't. You haven't since 1875, when your insurance paid the claim. The railroad has invested time and resources into this recovery. Then you should bill Continental Insurance for those resources. That's between you and them. My obligation is to the actual owner of the property, and I intend to fulfill it properly." Whitmore stared at him, recalculating rapidly. "This isn't over, Mr. Vance." "No," Elias agreed, "but it's over on your terms. From now on, we play by the actual rules, not the ones you tried to impose." After Whitmore left, Elias stood in his workshop and felt something he hadn't felt in months, the clear, clean certainty of knowing he was doing the right thing in the right way. He'd made mistakes, yes. He'd delayed and schemed and struggled with temptation, but in the end, he'd found his way back to the path his conscience had been pointing toward all along. The gold would go back to its rightful owners. The families would receive compensation, and Elias would receive whatever the insurance company deemed fair for an honest finder. It wasn't perfect, but it was right, and right now, that was enough. The Continental Insurance representative turned out to be a woman named Sarah Chen, sharp and efficient, who arrived with a team of appraisers and legal documentation. She examined the gold, verified its authenticity, and listened to Elias's full account with the kind of focused attention that suggested she missed nothing. "This is remarkable," she said after 3 days of careful assessment. "We'd written off this claim decades ago. The recovery represents a significant asset for the company." She paused, studying Elias carefully. "I understand you've outlined certain conditions for the return." Elias presented his terms clearly. $50,000 each to the families of Samuel Brennan and Patrick O'Hare, funding for a memorial and scholarship program in their names, and a 15% finder's fee for himself. The insurance company would recover approximately 70% of the original value, adjusted for current gold prices, still a substantial windfall for a claim they'd considered closed. Sarah Chen consulted with her company for 2 days, then returned with a counteroffer: $40,000 per family, slightly reduced memorial funding, and a 12% finder's fee. It was less than Elias had hoped for, but more than he'd feared. After brief negotiation, they settled on $45,000 per family, reasonable memorial funding, and 13% for Elias. The legal paperwork took weeks, but eventually everything was executed properly. The gold was removed from the workshop under heavy security, transported to a facility where it would be processed and sold. The families received their compensation. Elias had insisted on personally delivering those notifications, traveling to Denver to meet with the descendants of Brennan and O'Hare and explain how their ancestors' sacrifice had finally been acknowledged. The meetings were difficult but necessary. Both families had heard stories of the robbery, had grown up knowing their grandfathers had died, protecting gold that was never recovered. The money helped, but more important was the acknowledgement, the memorial that would ensure their names were remembered honorably. Thomas Blackwood's betrayal had legal consequences he hadn't anticipated. When the insurance company learned he'd made a separate deal with the railroad based on false claims of ownership, they pursued him for fraud. His $50,000 from the railroad was seized, and he faced criminal charges that would likely result in prison time. Elias felt no satisfaction in this outcome, only a kind of sad recognition that greed had trapped another man in consequences of his own making. The finder's fee, when finally calculated and paid, came to $63,000. It was more money than Elias had ever possessed, enough to secure his future and then some, but he'd learned something about wealth in the months since discovering the gold, having it mattered less than how you got it and what you did with it. He paid off his property taxes in full, invested in improvements to the workshop, and donated a substantial sum to the town's school fund. The rest he put away carefully, insurance against the uncertainties of age and health. Spring came to Redemption Creek with unusual warmth, melting the winter snow and bringing green back to the hills. Elias spent his days working in the workshop, not as a blacksmith but as a craftsman, making furniture and doing carpentry repairs for neighbors. The space that had held so much secret weight now felt lighter, cleaner, dedicated to honest work. His relationship with Margaret deepened naturally, moving from friendship to something more intentional. On a warm evening in May, they sat on her porch as they had so many times before, and he asked her a question he'd been considering for months. "Would you consider marrying me? I know I'm not young with this, and I'm not rich despite what people might think about that finder's fee, but I can offer you honesty, companionship, and whatever years I have left." Margaret smiled, that gentle expression he'd come to treasure. "I'm not young either, Elias, and I'm not looking for riches, but honesty and companionship, those I value highly. Yes, I'll marry you." They wed in June, a simple ceremony in the church with the whole town attending. Mayor Brewster performed the service, and even young Tom Fletcher came with his wife, bringing a set of hand-forged fireplace tools as a wedding gift. The community that had welcomed Elias as a stranger now embraced him as one of their own, a man who'd faced temptation and chosen integrity. The memorial for Brennan and O'Hare was dedicated in August, a simple granite monument in Redemption Creek's small park. Their names were carved deep into the stone, along with the dates of their deaths and a simple inscription, "In service to duty, in memory forever." The scholarship fund would send one deserving student to college each year, a legacy that would outlast all of them. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, Elias thought about Silas Blackwood and the choices that had led to so much trouble. The smith had made mistakes, had been coerced and frightened, but in the end, he'd tried to make things right. His journal had been the key that unlocked everything, had pointed Elias toward a better path. Elias kept the journal in a locked drawer, a reminder of where the journey had started. He never showed it to anyone except Margaret, who read it once and then set it aside with a thoughtful expression. "He was a man who got lost and tried to find his way back," she said. "Just like you did." "I like to think I found it," Elias replied. "You did," Margaret confirmed. "You found your way home." Life in Redemption Creek settled into comfortable rhythms. The workshop stayed busy with carpentry work, the hotel continued to operate under Margaret's capable management, and the community thrived with the small improvements that Elias's contributions helped fund. The town was growing, not dramatically but steadily, building something lasting. On quiet mornings, when Elias opened the workshop doors and looked out at the street, he sometimes thought about the day he'd first arrived with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags. He'd been searching for a place to belong, for work that mattered, for a life that meant something beyond mere survival. He'd found all of that, though not in the way he'd expected. The gold had been both a curse and a blessing, a test that had pushed him to understand what kind of man he wanted to be. In the end, he'd chosen to be the man Margaret believed him to be: honest, thoughtful, and willing to do what was right, even when it cost him dearly. Sometimes life's greatest treasures really do hide in unlikely places. But the real treasure, Elias had learned, wasn't the gold hidden under black paint. It was the integrity found under pressure, the courage discovered in difficulty, and the peace that came from knowing you'd walked the hardest path because it was the right one. He was home now, truly home, and that was worth more than all the gold in the world.